discussions about diplomatic talks continue to dominate the information sphere of the war in Ukraine. Russia, Ukraine, and the United States are making their positions known, as the world is sleepwalking into yet another stage of global confrontation. In this video on the war in Ukraine, we will talk about the possibility of negotiations and the most recent updates on the battlefield. Do you know why people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? 2 new exclusive videos weekly and other perks, including early access to all videos, voting rights on the next videos and series, access to our private Discord and our schedule, and much more. More than 200 exclusive videos are available to our patrons and YouTube members, including the series on the Spanish War of Succession, Punic Wars, Pacific War, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. Join them via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Most importantly, their kind support allows us to create 3 free videos per week without worrying and pay our team members competitive salaries. Thanks for supporting us. In January 2025, the Russian army continued advancing in different sectors of Donbass. A bad situation persists for the Ukrainians from Velika Novosilka to Pokrovsk. The capture of Remivka on January 17th meant that now all the supply lines to Velika Novosilka were cut. At this point, Russian forces effectively trapped the 110th Ukrainian Brigade in this town. On January 26th, Velika Novosilka was captured. At least some Ukrainian soldiers trapped there were killed or captured. After seizing Kurikove, the Russians have likely deprioritized this axis, focusing on the main prize in this area, Pokrovsk. And they made important gains here too. The Russians captured Kotlina to cut the TO406 highway, one of the supply lines to Pokrovsk. They have also advanced north of Vodvezhenka and are on the doorstep of another supply line, the TO504 highway. The situation is extremely threatening. For now, the Ukrainians have managed to stop the Russians north of Kotlina, but the Russian movement suggests they might aim to advance on Rishina, which would make Ukrainian control of Pokrovsk practically untenable due to supply issues. Russia has also achieved some progress in Chasiv Yar, where they captured the refractory plant on January 18th, and in Toretsk, where most of the town has now fallen under their control. Mixed news is coming from the Kupiansk front too. Earlier, the Russians had 2 bridgeheads on the left bank of the Oskil. The Ukrainians have successfully cleared up the one in Novomalinsk, but it looks like the Russian Storm Z have expanded their bridgehead in Dvorichna towards Zapatna. So Ukraine has lost some ground in all of the hottest parts of the battlefield, which has been the case basically since the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024. Russia is losing a lot of men, but keeps recruiting new men to offset the losses, ensuring a slow, costly, but consistent advance. Recently, an article by the Ukrainska Pravda newspaper mentioned the main causes of problems experienced by the Ukrainian army in different sectors. In Pokrovsk, poor overall command by the Khotitsia group of forces and inefficient allocation of resources, along with a commonly mentioned problem of manpower shortages, are cited as the main problems. The infantry shortage was mentioned as the key problem in Velika Novosilka, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar sectors too. The Ukrainian command is trying to address some of these issues. On January 26th, Zelensky appointed a new commander to the Khotitsia group. He is Mikhailo Depreti, who is also the ground forces commander, and is best known for stabilizing the situation in Kharkiv Oblast during the second Russian offensive. But evidently the manpower shortage remains the biggest problem for Ukraine, despite the lowering of the draft age to 25 in May 2024. According to the Washington Post, Ukraine has drafted around 200,000 men since then, but this has not been enough. Soldiers interviewed for this article claim that this decision came too late, at a time when the Ukrainians' brigades had already depleted much of their manpower. Hence, the United States has been privately persuading Kyiv to make the unpopular decision of lowering the mobilization age to 18. Most importantly, Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, publicly called for this. So far, Zelensky has been resisting these calls. His most common retort is that Ukraine's allies have not even managed to arm the existing brigades. The Ukrainian president stated that the Ukrainian army of 880,000 people actually outnumbers the Russian army of 600,000 in Ukraine. The problem is that the Ukrainian command has to deploy a major portion of its military in non-frontline territories to defend against any surprise Russian attacks. As a result, according to the New York Times, Ukraine has approximately 250,000 men on the front lines against more than 400,000 Russians. The manpower disadvantage is evident, and the Russians are capitalizing on it. On the other hand, it is easy to see why Zelensky wants to avoid this decision at all costs. Ukraine was already suffering from a demographic crisis prior to the war, and the Russian invasion made things even worse. But Ukraine seems to be between a rock and a hard place. The manpower shortages may eventually cause catastrophic consequences, and to avoid them, Kyiv may ultimately take this tough decision. Because there are indicators that things are getting worse. In mid-January, reports of deployment of specialists from air defense to the infantry emerged. To be fair, the Ukrainian command stated that such transfers would not happen anymore. Specialists are just too valuable, and training them takes time. Another common criticism against the Ukrainian military were the reports of creation of new brigades from the newly drafted soldiers, instead of sending them into the more experienced standing brigades. The mass desertion from the France-trained 155th Mechanized Brigade indicates that this tactic is not effective, as the newly mobilized tend to have lower morale and would be better served being deployed next to experienced soldiers who have been going through the hell of war for months, if not years. According to prominent Ukrainian military correspondent Yuri Butazov, Zelensky ordered to stop this practice, and from now on the newly mobilized would be sent into the standing brigades instead. To finalize the description of the military component of the war, let's briefly talk about the situation on the Kursk front. Ukraine attempted another offensive on January 4th towards Berdin. Although it initially succeeded to push the Russians away, ultimately the Ukrainians could not solidify their control over the initially seized area. A couple of days later, the Russians advanced in the area between Novaivanovka and Malaya Logna. Russia is gradually pushing the Ukrainian army out of Kursk, as they are relentlessly attacking with the help of their North Korean friends. In mid-January, South Korean intelligence claimed that 300 North Koreans had already been killed, with 2,700 being wounded. The North Korean government is expected to send a few more thousand troops to aid Russia in Kursk and gain valuable military experience. North Korea is also reportedly sending military equipment to Russia. The Ukrainian military intelligence chief Budanov stated that North Korea has given 120 M1989 Koksan artillery systems and 120 M1991 MLRS since November 2024, and is planning to send a few hundred missiles as well. Of course, Ukraine continued getting pledges and deliveries of weapons from Western allies, amidst increasing uncertainty. France confirmed that Ukraine will receive an unspecified number of Mirage 5F fighter jets by the end of the first quarter of 2025. But the impact of these jets should not be exaggerated. They are expected to compensate for the Ukrainian losses of Su-24s and are not in a position to threaten Russia's air superiority. Most recently, the spokesman of the Ukrainian Air Force, Yuri Ilnat, admitted that their F-16 jets do not have the most modern modifications, including lacking powerful radar systems, which prevent them from challenging the Russian air superiority too. Hence, the F-16s have primarily been used in air defense capacity in Ukraine. In January, Germany, Norway, Canada, Latvia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden and the Czech Republic pledged military aid to Ukraine, which includes air defense systems and missiles, drones, anti-tank weapons, artillery, and support to Ukraine's domestic military production. The European Union finally sent €3 billion, the first tranche from proceeds of frozen Russian assets. Remember, this aid has been debated and promised over and over again, which says a lot about the lack of urgency from the Europeans, even though the war is being fought literally at their doorstep. Still, Ukraine is not really in a position to complain much, because it continues to be heavily dependent on Western aid. According to Zelensky, in 2024, Ukraine spent $100 billion on war expenses. $40 billion was covered by Ukraine, $35 by the USA, and $25 by the EU. Of course, the question that looms largest is the continuation of American aid. On January 9th, the outgoing Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin, announced the last military aid package of the Biden administration worth $500 million. Is the Trump administration going to continue military aid? For now, the United States has suspended almost all overseas aid, but this does not include military aid to Ukraine, although nothing new has been pledged to Kyiv so far. But at least rhetorically, Donald Trump and his appointees remain very active regarding the war in Ukraine. Trump has certainly become less hostile towards Ukraine since his election, and has been publicly pushing Putin to end the war. There are claims that Trump does not want to see Ukraine lose under his presidency to avoid his own Afghanistan moment. He fears that Russia's outright victory will embolden China, which Trump sees as the main adversary of the United States at the moment. Following his inauguration, Trump said, referring to Putin, "He is destroying Russia. He should make a deal. Zelensky wants to make a deal." He also went on to claim that Russia has lost 1 million people in the war, while Ukraine's casualties were 700,000. Again, take Trump's numbers with a grain of salt. Also because just a month before that, he posted on Truth Social that Russia had lost 600,000 soldiers dead or wounded against 400,000 losses for Ukraine. A few days later, Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, claimed 80,000 dead for the Ukrainian army, while adding that the Russian losses have been 5 times higher. It is still unclear what exactly Trump is offering to the sides to sit them down for negotiations, but the most common peace project speculated in the media consists of the following provisions: the war to stop at the current front lines, which would turn into a demilitarized zone manned by European peacekeepers; Ukraine would receive security guarantees while indefinitely giving up on its aspirations of joining NATO. In turn, sanctions against Russia would be lifted. But objections and reservations regarding this plan are already being voiced. At least on a rhetorical level, the Kremlin demands more. Putin's aide and one of the architects of the Kremlin's imperialist designs, Nikolai Patrushev, stated in his interview that the international recognition of the annexation of 4 oblasts, including the areas under Ukrainian control and Crimea, is a non-negotiable starting point for negotiations. Russian officials also regularly still talk about demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Demilitarization stands for forcing Ukraine to agree to have a much smaller army with no or very little Western equipment, which was one of the demands of Russia at the Istanbul talks. Denazification stands for removing the current government and installing a pro-Russia leader in Ukraine. The Kremlin will likely continue insisting on this maximalist position as a starting point, but Trump believes he has leverage. He has already admitted that more sanctions may be imposed on Russia. A more problematic scenario for Russia would be a drop of oil prices. Trump argued on January 23rd that high oil prices allow Russia to continue waging war, and called on OPEC to drop oil prices to basically force Putin to end the war. The Trump administration is also reportedly discussing further military aid to Ukraine, but perhaps the biggest deterrent to Putin would be lower oil prices. The Russian economy is already quite overstretched due to sanctions and excessive war expenses, and losing oil revenues would be a heavy blow to Putin's capacity to wage war. Ukrainian society and Zelensky seem keen on finding a respectable way to end the war without surrendering the country's sovereignty. It looks like on the whole the purported Trump plan is acceptable, but Kyiv has some questions too, particularly about security guarantees and the peacekeeping force. Ukraine wants strong security guarantees, something concrete to protect it from another Russian invasion. Zelensky wants at least 200,000 peacekeepers, which would include American boots on the ground as well. He believes that the European presence alone will not be sufficient, and American troops should also be on the ground. For him, this would be a real deterrent to Putin's further aggression against Ukraine. But there does not seem to be any appetite from the American side to get involved in this potential peacekeeping mission directly. But these are all speculations. At this point, there is a lot of talk about putting an end to the war, which is not nothing. But we are yet to see any breakthrough towards negotiations. And these pre-peace talk discussions may take months if not years, until the point when waging war becomes too expensive for Putin. Meanwhile, the war is about to complete its 3rd year. So let's conclude by looking at the visually documented equipment losses suffered by both parties as of January 30th. According to the Oryx blog, Russia has lost at least 3,718 tanks, 8,935 vehicles, 297 command posts and communication stations, 1,448 artillery systems and vehicles, 453 multiple rocket launchers, 134 aircraft, and 151 helicopters. Ukraine has lost at least 1,060 tanks, 3,701 vehicles, 31 command posts and communication stations, 715 artillery systems and vehicles, 80 multiple rocket launchers, 102 aircraft, and 50 helicopters. Further updates on the war in Ukraine are on the way. If you don't want to miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.